Welcome to Dental Business RX. Practice success in 30 minutes or less.
Thank you for calling ABC Dental.
By survey, employee-related issues, finding, hiring, training, retaining, and so on, are among the top 3 problems that owner dentists and office managers face in practice, and they have been for years. And I've touched on a number of tools you can use to improve these employee-related areas in prior episodes. But that said, there's no shortcut to mastering the subject. Like any craft, it takes training, application, experience, and mistakes in application to make a pro with regards to personnel. This is what we cover on the MGE Power Program. Sorry to get a shameless plug in so early. I'll put a link to it on the episode webpage. But with all of that said, is there something that you could do right now that would make training new employees far easier? And as an added bonus, not only increase or improve training, but application, performance, and retention. Well, there is, and that's what I want to talk to you about in this week's episode. My name is Jeff Bloomberg, and I'm your host. And these learning tools that I'll be discussing this week actually have application far beyond just employee training. They can be used to help yourself, communicate with patients better, help your kids in school, or just about anyone that's trying to learn a subject or improve their performance. So what am I talking about here? Well, the tools I'm talking about have to do with study, and specifically how to overcome the biggest barriers to learning and application. Now, you might go, well, why are you talking about study, Jeff? Well, think about it for a second. If I'm trying to train a new employee, what am I first asking them to do? I'm asking them to study whatever material I'm asking them to learn. If they're learning about EagleSoft or Open Dental, better mention Dentrix, or the Dentrix folks are going to be upset there. If I'm asking them to learn this, they have to read something first. Even if I'm teaching someone to be a receptionist and how to answer the phone, they still have to study the phone pattern that I'm asking them to use when they answer the phone. It's a great day at Dr. So-and-so's office. My name is blah. I can help you. That's study. Now, obviously, what you're hoping for when you're training an employee is that they're going to study whatever it is that you're showing them and then actually be able to do it. And if you look at it, that's essentially what training is. You're asking somebody to replicate what you're already doing or what someone has done before. That's it. Any profession is to that end. Of course, there's artistic flourishes and individualization, had trouble with that word there, in application. Okay, but you're asking them to study, replicate, learn, and apply. That's essentially what we're looking for here. And if you're familiar with the MGE program, you know that a large portion of our curriculum comes from the Hubbard Management System developed by L. Ron Hubbard. Now, a little bit about Mr. Hubbard. He spent close to 30 years researching this system, and it consists of millions of words in numerous volumes of reference material. It covers just about anything you might conceive of with regards to running, managing, and scaling an organization, from communication to sales to how to become more organized, efficient, statistic management, leadership, financial planning, and so on. And the tools I'll be covering with you in this episode come from Mr. Hubbard. And as I said, they have to do with study and learning. So what Mr. Hubbard did is he actually studied the subject of study. How does learning actually occur? What stops learning, what improves learning, what increases application and retention. And he isolated 3 barriers to study and learning. Now, I'm going to cover these 3 barriers directly in Mr. Hubbard's words, and we're going to go over how you can apply this immediately to improve the training systems in your practice. So this comes from an article from Mr. Hubbard titled Barriers to Study. And I'll start off with the first paragraph, then I want to talk about this for just a second before we get into these barriers. This is the first thing he says. There are 3 different sets of physiological and mental reactions that come from 3 different aspects of study. They are 3 different sets of symptoms. Now, notice something there. He said these are physiological and mental reactions when studying. This is how these barriers manifest, in other words, which you'll see as I go through this. So what's physiological? Other having to do with the body or systems. Okay, and then we have mental reactions. So what's the first barrier? Education in the absence of mass in which the technology will be involved is very hard on the student. So what's mass? From a scientific perspective, it's the amount of matter in a subject, right? And what is mass? Essentially, it's solidified energy. Like my cup of coffee is mass, right? So when we're educating somebody and we lack mass, as he says here, it is very hard on the students. So here he goes on. It actually makes him feel squashed, makes him feel bent, sort of spinny, sort of dead, bored, exasperated. What's exasperated? Irritated or frustrated. So if you have somebody studying and in the absence of mass, which we'll get into this a little bit more, it will make the person feel squashed, bent, sort of spinny, sort of dead, bored, exasperated, which again, irritated or frustrated. If he goes on, Mr. Hubbard, if he is studying the doingness of something in which the mass is absent, this will be the result. Photographs help, and motion pictures would do pretty good, as they are a sort of promise or hope of the mass, but the printed page and the spoken word are not a substitute for a tractor if he's studying about tractors. Okay, so you get where this is at. This last paragraph is the big reveal. Photographs and motion pictures would do pretty good as they are sort of promise or hope of the mass, but the printed page and the spoken word are not a substitute for a tractor if he is studying about tractors. Okay, so you're teaching somebody how to use some software and they're looking at a page in your manual and they're just looking at it and they're looking at, when you hit this button, this happens. When you hit this happens. You're not giving them any mass. In other words, you're not sitting them in front of the computer with a dummy company open while they're able to do this and see the actual thing. Or you're trying to explain to somebody what an implant is without actually showing them an implant or showing them a model of an implant. That would be mass, okay? You're scheduling a new patient and you've written up how to schedule a new patient, but then you actually haven't shown the person in the physical universe what that actually looks like. Here's a new patient form. Here's an actual form that you'd be filling out. And here's what we fill out in the computer. See, here's the computer. We're filling it out. So this tells you that when someone's learning about something, you want to accompany it with the actual physical items associated with what they're learning about. Ideally, the actual item itself. A picture would help if you have a picture, but in the absence, could you imagine reading about how to file insurance with absolutely no screenshots, because that's a form of mass, on what the screen will look like when you actually do the filing? This is where, screenshots and videos can help, but nothing's going to replace the real thing. So this is something you can use with your staff. This is something you can use with your patients. You probably already do. At least I hope you do. If you're explaining a procedure, you have some form of a visual aid, something. A video is good. Heck, if I was explaining an implant to a patient, I might show them a model of an implant. Then I might show them an actual implant. Because, the model of the screw is like 4 inches long. Is that how big that thing is? No. Here's an actual implant. And then we're going to put a healing cap on. What's a healing cap? This is a healing cap. Okay, this is how this works. You're showing them the actual thing that you're trying to educate them in, and they can then associate the words with the actual thing. So that's our first barrier, education in the absence of mass, okay? So what's the second barrier? This is from Mr. Hubbard. There's another series of physiological phenomena that exist, which is based on the fact of too steep a study gradient. So now what's a gradient? If you think of a gradient literally, if you're driving up a mountain, it's the slope or the curve upward or downward. Gradient can also mean the change in a physical property of something, its weight, its temperature, etc. But in this sense, think of the gradient in this sense figuratively. We have that slope or that incline. So if you look at all learning is done as a series of things that you learn that then one builds on the next. One builds on the next. One builds on the next. So if you could imagine this, let's say you're in dental school and you just learned about crowns. You've not even worked on a model yet. You've done nothing yet. And then you've just you've been in the class, you read your textbook, and then your professor brings you to clinic and says, okay, good, prep a crown on this patient. You'd start to freak out. We've missed some of the steps in between. As he said here, we have too steep a study gradient. So here he goes on and he explains this. He says, this is from Mr. Hubbard again, there's another source of physiological study reaction because of too steep a gradient. It's sort of a confusion or a reelingness that goes with this one. So what is confusion? Obviously, we can all think, what's reeling mean? Could mean physically you're sort of staggering or lurching, or you feel disoriented or bewildered. He goes on, you've hit too steep a gradient. There was too much of a jump because he didn't understand what he was doing, and he jumped to the next thing, and that was too steep, and he went too fast, and we'll assign all of his difficulties to this new thing. The remedy for this, one of too steep a gradient, is cutting back. Find out when he was not confused on the gradient, then what new action he undertook to do. Find what action he understood well. Just before he was all confused, what did he understand well? And then we find out that he didn't understand it well. So let's look at this in application and training. You've just trained somebody how to answer a phone call in your practice, and now you're having them do something far more severe or complex. They really don't understand. They're not really good at the phones yet, and now you're having them schedule in the software. They don't really understand how the software works. They don't understand your X and O system for doctor time, assistant time. They're going to start feeling confused, bewildered. They're going to have a reelingness or a confused type feeling, right? So what you would do is you would cut back, again, is what Mr. Hubbard says here. We'd go back to where, find out what action he understood well just before he was all confused. What did he understand well? Then we find out he didn't understand it well. You'll find that right before you jumped him into the next thing, he didn't really get it that well. So what would he do? We'd go back, we'd make sure they got it well before we advance them to the next thing. Okay. So, and one thing to keep in mind, with regards to study and learning, there's sort of how would I explain this from a realistic perspective? You're training a new employee. Now, pretty much anybody is trainable. The question is, are they trainable within the time frame that works for your practice, and are you applying the correct training tools? So let's say the average person, I want to train them how to do reactivation calls. It's a brand new employee, and I want to see if they can do some reactivation for me. So I bring them in, and the average person within about 3 hours can pretty much, they've read what they have to read. We've applied it a bit. I've listened to them do a few phone calls to make sure they're not messing it up too hard. I've role played with them, etc. And 3 hours is about the average. Some people are faster. Some people might take 3.5. But then I bring somebody in, and it takes like 9 hours to train this person. And I'm making sure that I have mass, and I'm making sure I'm not skipping a gradient, so to speak. Well, and I'm going to get into this last barrier, which is kind of critical. But the point being is that in certain cases, if the training period is so excessively long compared to your average employee, then maybe it's just not going to work. They're not a good fit for your business, okay? But that assumes a lot. It assumes, number one, that you have some type of formalized training, and that you're actually making sure that you're supplying mass and you're not skipping gradients, and you're not also skipping this next barrier that I'm going to talk about. So let's see this third barrier, as Mr. Hubbard describes it. So what's the third barrier to study? He says there is this third one, an entirely different set of physiological reactions brought about through a bypassed definition. A bypassed definition gives one a distinctly blank feeling, or a washed out feeling. Just to interject, washed out, what would that mean? Drained, exhausted, etc. He goes on. A not there feeling and a sort of nervous hysteria will follow in the back of that. So this is this third barrier to study. And later on in this article, just to give you the importance of this bypass definition, he mentions this. He says, although I've given this one of the misunderstood definition last, it is the most important one. So again, we have the misunderstood definition, the bypass definition. This is the most important barrier to study. How do you know somebody has a misunderstood definition? Or we'll sometimes call it a misunderstood word. Well, what are the physiological reactions again? Blank feeling. You ever felt blank? You're reading a book, you get to the bottom of the page, and you go, what in the world did I just read? You feel sort of blank. It also gives you a not there feeling. I've had that studying, and then I just feel like, where am I? And a sort of nervous hysteria will follow in the back of that. Then you're studying, and you keep studying for a bit. You feel blank. You feel washed out. You're yawning a little bit. You feel drained. You feel exhausted. You go, I just got to get out of here and go take a walk. You're sort of jittery. This is the misunderstood. And as he says, it's the most important one. So, what else does he say about this misunderstood definition? He says the manifestation of quote-unquote blow stems from this third aspect of study, which is the misunderstood definition or the not comprehended definition, the undefined word. So what does he mean by blow? Well, We're using this definition here for Mr. Hubbard. Departures, sudden and relatively unexplained from positions, jobs, locations, and areas. You ever had an employee just randomly quit? Or, a person doesn't show up for school the next day. They just don't want to go back. That's a blow. Or they, in the middle of class, they just get up and walk out to go to the bathroom and never come back. That's blowing, okay, in this sense. So back to this, he says, the manifestation of blow stems from this third aspect of study, which is the misunderstood definition, or the not comprehended definition, the undefined word. That's the one that produces the blow. The person doesn't necessarily blow on these other two. The other two we've talked about, the absence of mass or the skipped gradient. They are not pronouncedly blow phenomena. They're simply physiological phenomena. The one of the misunderstood definition is so much more important. It's the makeup of human relations, the mind and subjects. It establishes aptitude and lack of aptitude. So let that sink in for a second. So first off, not the fact that he's just saying it's most important, but it's the makeup of human relations. So if I'm communicating to you or you're communicating to me, and you say something that I don't understand, okay, I now have a misunderstood word. I'm going to have these same phenomena kick in. I'm eventually feel blank. You ever had a patient that all of a sudden looks blank after you're explaining their treatment plan to them, after you've told them about the periapical radiolucency that you've just pointed up, or the abscess that they have, or how you want to do this with this or this with, like they don't understand, or the buccal surface of their tooth, or all of a sudden they look a bit blank. Well, you're actually lowering the communication factor between you and the patient. And communication, whether it's verbal, written, if you're reading a book, you're communicating maybe on a delay with the author. If you're listening to a lecture, that's a form of communication. You're reading a letter, that's a form of communication, an email, a text, or you're talking to somebody. So when you start having misunderstood words salted throughout that communication, you end up with non-comprehension. Now, he goes further. He also says, as he mentioned here, it establishes aptitude and lack of aptitude. He goes on. It's the definition of words, the misunderstood word. That's all it goes back to. And that produces such vast panorama of mental effects that it itself is the prime factor involved with stupidity and the prime factor involved with many other things. So I mentioned earlier you can apply this not just with staff, but you can apply this with yourself, you can apply this with your kids, you can apply this with your patients. So let's say your kid is not doing well in school, or they hate a particular subject, or they don't want to study it anymore. Here's the one thing I'll guarantee you. They have misunderstoods in that subject. Find them. It's not that difficult. Now, there's many different ways a person could misunderstand a word. I'm not going to get into that because this is supposed to be a shorter podcast. We have whole courses on this, on the subject of study, and if you want to know more about it, just contact us here at MG Online. But your kid has MUs in that area. I've seen so many parents, because we go over this study technology very early in our program, because our program is all about study. Or about, rather, it's learning. They have to learn and apply, right? So, a doctor will come in, they'll learn about the basics of study technology, they'll do the course, and they'll go home, and then, their kids are having trouble in a particular area, they'll find their misunderstood words, and all of a sudden their kids straighten out and start doing great in school. It's just a funny thing, So this has a universal application. And as I mentioned with patients, when you're communicating with a patient, if you're going to give them a new term, define the term and make sure they understand it. Or try to stay away from technical terms if you don't have to use them. Sure, it makes you sound cool. You're the doctor and you get to use all kinds of, cool Latin and Greek words. But why? Unless the person sitting in front of you is another doctor. You want the person to understand you. That's what this is all about, right? We want to increase comprehension. Now, he goes on. This is kind of interesting here. He says, if a person didn't have misunderstoods, his talent might or might not be present, but his doingness would be present. So I'll read that again. If a person didn't have misunderstoods, his talent might or might not be present, but his doingness would be present. So he may or may not be talented in a particular area, but he'd be able to do something in that area. He gives more of an example. We can't say that Joe would paint as well as Bill if both were logical on the subject of art, but we can say that the inability of Joe to paint compared with the ability of Joe to do the motions of painting is dependent exclusively and only upon definitions, exclusively and only upon definitions. So think that through for a second. Maybe this person wouldn't be the most talented salesperson, but if they didn't have any misunderstoods in the whole sales cycle or subject of sales, they'd at least be able to do what you taught them to do, which is really what we're trying to do here, folks, right? When you're training somebody, you want them to replicate what you're teaching them, or they're going to have trouble doing that if they have misunderstoods. So he ends off with this. That's very important because it tells you what happens to doingness and that the restoration of doingness depends only upon the restoration of understanding on the misunderstood word, misunderstood definition. So, I went over some basic ideas and how to apply the, adding mass when you're training or even when you're explaining something to a patient. You could do this with your kids too. I remember doing it with my kids. They were reading about the solar system and planets and stars or whatever. I went outside and grabbed a telescope. Look at that star. Yeah. There's this one. There's that. There's the North Star. I want you to look up close. Okay, look at this. These are the areas of the moon that are being talked about in your book. It gives them mass. And then there's the skip gradient, which again, you don't want to throw somebody ahead too fast, and it tells you exactly what that looks like. This misunderstood word concept has incredible application. Not that the other two don't, but it's applicable everywhere. Like I said, with patients, with your kids, with yourself, anytime you're trying to learn a subject. But let's talk about employee training for a second. So let's say you're hiring people who have zero dental experience. So when you walk into a dental practice, there is all kinds of new terminology that they're having to learn left and right. And not just dental terminology. There's insurance terminology. There's abbreviations. There's a lot to know. Well, do you have access to where the person can define these things easily? Do you have like a little dental dictionary around the practice? I mean, they can always Google it, but do you have like a ready reference where a person can look up whatever they may not understand? Now, I have as a download, if you want, we have as a free download, I'll put it on the episode webpage, a dental dictionary you can use with your employees or with your newer employees especially, just so that they can understand things better, as they're learning their jobs. But I would make sure that any new hire that I had understood that if they don't understand something, like it's a bigger deal if you pass something you don't understand and don't get it clarified than asking to have it clarified. Nobody's going to be mad at you if you ask what something means. And no one should. Because you want that. You want the person to learn and understand things as they go, and you'd be surprised how, it depends on your staff. I mean, obviously every staff is different, but you may have a receptionist who has no clue what an implant really is or does, or has no clue what scaling or root planning means, or what it means to plane something even. These are words, right? So patient asks them about it and they just, they kind of draw a blank. Well, yeah, it's really good. The doctor really likes it when patients do it. They don't have conviction because they don't understand it. So I would have keywords that your employees should know. I've got that dental dictionary you can download if you want. You want to make sure that they understand that they should be defining things as they are getting trained. And if they don't know the definition of something or don't understand something, they always get it clarified. Because if they clarify it, as Mr. Hubbard was referring to, you start to see a restoration of doingness, which is really what we want. We want people doing things, right? We don't want people just reading things. And I can't overstress the power of just making sure that a person understands what it is that they're learning and understands all the terminology in it. And I'm sure you could think this thing through. It may seem silly, but I remember, and there's different educational methods, but I remember early on in my education in grade school, you weren't supposed to use a dictionary. You're supposed to guess what words mean, which it's kind of silly when you think about it because some words sound similar. Some words are spelled the same. It's just not a good idea. If you're going to be speaking a language, we should all have an agreed upon definition for what this language means. Otherwise, we're not really communicating, are we? Right? Anyway, those are the basics right there. You can use it in your training. You can use it in your case presentations. You can use it at home with your kids. You can use it for yourself when you're trying to learn a new subject. Obviously, there's a lot more material on the subject of study that Mr. Hubbard studied. This is a half-hour podcast, so I'm just kind of giving you the highlights, so something you can use right away. We do training on it. It's actually the first course a new power client will do is a study course so that they know how to actually learn, or we're going to have problems as we start to train them. Because the idea of doing the MGE Power Program is not to say that you did the Power Program. It's to be able to actually apply what you learned in the Power Program. That's kind of the point, right? So knowing how to do this is very important. Last area that I'd mentioned that you want to apply this is in your marketing. I've seen promotional cards go out with, we have a CEREC machine, or we have a CT scan or a cone beam, and like a patient has no idea what this is. It's not a selling point. Keep in mind you don't want to immediately cut the communication in your marketing by throwing a bunch of terminology in that they don't understand. Anyway, quick tip. Thought I'd throw it out to you. I hope this helps. It's helped me immensely. It's helped my children immensely. I've seen it help thousands of our clients and many children as well, many kids here. Hope you can use it. And don't forget, I've got that link to the dental dictionary. If you want to download it, I would definitely, you can get it. You can always edit it, make it your own for your own practice. It's at least a good point to start from. And don't forget, when you're training somebody, make sure that they're comfortable asking questions and you create an environment where it's not like they're made wrong for defining words. Okay? Anyway, folks, I hope this helps. That's all I have for you this week. If you want to know more about MGE, you can find us online at mgeonline.com or call us at 800-640-1140. Have a great week, and we'll see you at the next episode.